Latest in strategic affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for updates.
This is StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh, Revi, and joining us from near Auckland in New Zealand in this exclusive interview is Helen Clark. She is, of course, a global leader in sustainable development and gender equality and has been a three-term Prime Minister of New Zealand, as well as a two-tenure Administrator of the United Nations Development Program, UNDP. Ms. Clark, thank you so much for your time. Glad to have you on StratNews again.
Thank you.
Just looking at the situation in Afghanistan, and I'm sure you'll want to talk in depth about the multiple crises, whether it's a conflict, whether it's the economy, whether it's a humanitarian, women's rights. But I just wanted to look at, because of your experience, get your take on how the United Nations Security Council is dealing with the situation, because it seems like everyone else is just looking at their national interests, all other countries, and in the UNSC as well. Now, there may have been a statement that was passed, which supposedly holds the Taliban to its commitments, but Russia, China abstaining in that. How do you see the UNSC's role in holding the Taliban to their commitments?
I think we will see the Security Council split in the same way it splits on Myanmar, the same way it splits on the Tigray conflict in Ethiopia. So you have the permanent three members from the West and the permanent two members, Russia and China, taking very different positions. And of course, Russia and China didn't agree on the resolution that was adopted, although they didn't obstruct it entirely. They abstained on it. Now, that was quite a limited resolution. It called for continued humanitarian access to the country. It called for the Taliban to ensure that those who wished to leave the country could do so safely, and it called on it to uphold women and children's rights. I think the attitude of most of the international community will be very much governed by what the Taliban actually does now, not by its words. You see some fine words through their savvy social media spokespeople and soft talk from Doha, but what is actually happening on the ground is what people want to know.
What is happening on the ground, but what leverage does the international community, the United Nations specifically, have over the Taliban to holding them to what they do on the ground? I mean, there are sanctions that both the US separately and the United Nations has in place. There's a sanctions committee, the 1988 sanctions committee, 1988, travel restrictions possibly. Is there any leverage that the international community has, and do the Taliban want to gain from what can be denied to them?
In the past, really no leverage at all worked with them. But of course, we start this chapter in Afghanistan against the background of the United States having negotiated with the Taliban, and the Taliban perhaps enjoying a little the international attention. So what we can't foresee at the moment is, will they want to take the seat for Afghanistan at the General Assembly of the United Nations? That would be a point of leverage if that was important to them. They're coming into a country where the economy has collapsed, where the IMF has frozen the access to funds which Afghanistan would have had, where the US government has frozen Afghanistan's assets in its banking system. So there are certainly points of economic leverage as well. So the question will be whether the Taliban put their head in the sand and say, we don't care about anything like that, and let the economy crash completely and the humanitarian crisis worsen, or whether they will be prepared to do some things to relieve some of those pressures.
Well, some things, and like you're talking about the leverage, I was mentioning the 1988 Committee on Sanctions, the travel bans that come up, I think, on 21st of September, if I'm not wrong, and as well as the extension that comes up earlier than that. In terms of the sanctions, specifically on individuals like the Haqqanis that the US has already had, and the Haqqanis are in charge of security in Kabul. Is that leverage that you think would work in getting the Taliban to, commit to doing what it says?
I guess it depends how high a price the Taliban are prepared to pay for getting those sanctions removed. Certainly, the US has had very strong feelings about the Haqqani network for a long time. So sanctions against that would not be lightly dropped. The Taliban would have to have a pretty impressive offer, I think, for there to be movement on that score. So I think the ball is really very much in their court, isn't it? What are they prepared to do to be dealt with by the international community, to give access to international financial and regional financial institution funds, diplomatic relations, and so on. As I say, in the past when they were in government, they didn't really care much about any of that. But do they care now? One of their major challenges actually is just a governance challenge. I doubt that you'll find too many diplomats in at the foreign ministry. Apart from the health ministry, public works, and I think one other, departmental people aren't at their desks. So they face a huge challenge just keeping their state functioning at all. And that's probably where their focus will be in the immediate future.
There's a comment or a question, if you like, Ms. Clark, from one of our viewers, Chaitanya. In this supposed multipolar world, the United Nations Security Council will always be split with competing interests. It's high time to review the P5 veto rights and expand the council. Your thoughts?
Oh, yes. The council permanent membership as it exists at the moment reflects the post-war settlement of 1945. And the world doesn't look like that anymore. I'm on the record of saying for many years that a great power like India should be a permanent member of the Security Council. So the reform of it, however, is extremely difficult because it can be vetoed by those who have had the veto since 1945. And again, there's polarization as to what the shape and structure of the Security Council should be.
We have seen an incident in New Zealand today, and Indian Tides mentions that one ISIS-inspired individual, apparently of Sri Lankan descent, who tried to knifed 6 people in New Zealand. The extremist ideology that we have seen with the Taliban in the past, and we've seen now even state television showing parades of pictures where they have the Taliban suicide bombers and all the terror machinery that they used in the past. How do you see the Taliban moving from what it was doing, which is a military conquest, to governance?
I think they'll be extremely challenged in doing that. And of course, over the last 2 decades, they've been insurgents. They were pushed from power, they regrouped, they started fighting. They controlled quite a lot of the countryside before this latest offensive, which took the capital and the regional and district capitals. But now they're having to defend all that ground, and they may find that those who've traditionally opposed them regroup to fight back. Now, I think of huge concern to all of us is that there are estimated to be something like 20 foreign terrorist groups operating in Afghanistan. Some are said to be fighting alongside the Taliban as they try this offensive in the Panjshir Valley at the present time. Now, does it make the world feel more secure to know that foreign terrorist groups have free reign in a Taliban-run Afghanistan? It makes me extremely uneasy, particularly on the day when New Zealand has had an ISIS extremist try to kill people in a suburban shopping mall.
Right. You mentioned the Panjshir Valley. There's another comment or a question from Sai Prasad. Mullah Baradar to reportedly had the Taliban government, Suhail Shaheen, in talks with Germany today. They are in talks with almost everybody. Former Vice President Amarullah Saleh, though, struggling for power. How do you see this entire series of events unfolding?
Well, I think there is more conflict going on than we're seeing global media focus on at the moment. And it's not just the Panjshir Valley, is my understanding. The Panjshir Valley has held out for years against the Taliban in the past. It was never conquered, but then it was part of a broader Northern Alliance grouping, which pushed back hard. And a lot of those militias melted away, shall we say, in the face of the recent Taliban offensive. So the Panjshir Valley people will be under a lot of pressure as to whether they can actually get supplies in. They are well armed, but at some point you have to resupply. So sadly, it's women and children and just ordinary folk who end up as the meat and the sandwich of these horrible conflicts as fighting goes on.
Well, two other strains of thought here, Ms. Clark. One is the root of the problem for the last 20 years, which has been across the Durand line. Moko asks, how is it that Pakistan gets away without crimes? And Rekha Pal asking a more important question, I think. What is the simplest commonsensical explanation one can give on why the world should legitimize a government led by a sanctioned or branded terrorist group?
Well, I think that's a very, very good question. I mean, this group has just fought its way into the capital and district and provincial capitals and dislodged a government that was elected by a constitutional process. So this is an unconstitutional takeover of power. Now, when that happens elsewhere in the world, usually, there is quite severe international condemnation. But it saddens me, as one who deeply cares about the fate of women and children and families in Afghanistan, that this insurgent group is somehow being treated now as if it's a legitimate actor. And I think that legitimization came through the years of withdrawal talks by the United States. I don't think they were ever peace talks, they were withdrawal talks. And to see after 20 years of investment in human development, people's rights, women's rights, children's rights, rights of free expression, to see that put on the bonfire, I find extremely distressing. So I would urge the international community to keep the bar rather high in terms of what it wants to extract from the Taliban before it deals with it.
Sai Prasad again has this comment. I think there's a Freudian slip here where he says this is a fanatic session. He means fantastic session, giving us an opportunity to chat with former Prime Minister Helen Clark. Thank you. Yes, it's a great pleasure to have her on the show again. When you're talking about setting the high bar, do you see that practically happening?
Well, if the letter of the Security Council resolution is observed, that is quite a high bar for the Taliban to allow free humanitarian access to the 18 million people who need emergency assistance, to ensure that those who wish to leave the country can do so without obstruction, to uphold the rights of women and children. So let's see how they behave in the face of that Security Council resolution. Security Council resolution, by the way, has the force of international law. So if you fly in the face of it, you put yourself as a attempted government in a very serious position.
However much we analyze or criticize the United Nations Security Council, on the ground, though, one of the international agencies which is staying there, which hasn't left, apart from the Chinese, the Russians, the Iranian, the Turk embassies, is the UN, right?
Yes. So my understanding is that the humanitarian agencies of the UN have stayed through Taliban rule before, and they will make every effort to stay now. In fact, they are the ones calling attention to the extremely serious humanitarian crisis that exists, with 18 million people said to be in need of humanitarian relief, of whom 10 million are children. So it's extremely serious, and the UN says there's only enough food stocks there to feed people for one more month. Well, if you can't feed people, we know what the result is. It's starvation. So you can count on World Food Programme, the High Commission for Refugees, the WHO, UNICEF, also the Red Cross. They'll be there trying to do their best. We don't know yet whether international NGOs will be able to operate. One agency I would like to give special mention to as well is UN Women, and the deputy of UN Women is Indian citizen Amitabh Bhatia, and they are staying with international staff in Kabul. They say they owe it to the girls and women of Afghanistan to be there and to advocate for them. And in this very dangerous and uncertain situation, I think that's extremely courageous and commendable.
Since you brought up the issue about women, we've seen, say, like Tolo TV, which had initially taken off its female anchors. Now the female anchor who hosts the Good Morning show is back. But mostly what we see is people are wary, even if there are stray reports of women being targeted or told, to wear a burqa or not go to work in institutions apart from health. How do you see, is there any indication that the Taliban has changed in that? Because, one of the problems will be that is if they are not ideologically rigid, they might lose control of their own people.
Well, yes, there's something in that too. So we're hearing different things. Yesterday, they were reported as saying that, yes, women would be in the government, but not in senior positions. Well, what does this mean? Do the women take the clerical jobs in the government departments or the cleaning? It seems pretty clear they're not going to be ministers. The parliament, of course, has gone into complete abeyance with this insurgent takeover. We're also hearing some of their spokespeople say, oh, yes, maybe the girls can go to school, but only up to puberty, in effect. So you have, in Afghanistan, 2/3 at least of the population is under the age of 25. And particularly in the cities and the large towns, you have young people boys have grown up unshaven, they've got their blue jeans, the girls and boys have got their pop music, they've been able to go to school and carry on, and many of them, reach their dreams for occupations. Now, if those doors close, that's, very, very serious breach of the rights of women and girls. So, as I say, let's judge them by their deeds, not their words.
So, in effect, we've seen conflict and what that is doing, but like we started off talking about the multiple crises, it's not just conflict, though that's bad enough. There's climate change, there's drought, the economy is at a standstill, population is majority of it is in poverty, there's gender inequality. All of that in confluence making it extremely hard for the Afghans who are still in the country.
Yes, and there's what we call in global media coverage the CNN effect, where we've been mesmerized for the last 2 weeks by the fall of Kabul and other cities, and then by the chaos of the evacuation. But behind that there's a whole lot of other stories, and that is what is the Taliban actually doing? And the truth is that you read the reports, not so prominent, of the folk singer who's killed because he plays music, the comedian who's killed because he made jokes about them, people who are being targeted still for assassination. I myself heard of one worker for an international organization who was hauled up in his car, told he was an infidel, stabbed a couple of times, and then when his children started screaming, they went away. But he felt that if his children hadn't been screaming, maybe they would have killed him altogether. So it's not a good scene. And I think we really need to look now at whether they have turned a new leaf or not. I'm skeptical.
In terms of keeping close, as you said, a high bar for what the Taliban do now. The regional countries or countries around the world are also looking at their self-interest, whether it's Russia doesn't want terrorism in Central Asia, the Chinese don't want it in Xinjiang, India doesn't want it in Kashmir. There's a lot of talk about how the US will also have a blowback at some point of time, whether it's Al Qaeda or some other groups. Pakistan has another problem to face. It's a real mess.
Oh, it is a major mess. And if you go back to the reason for the international military intervention in late 2001, it was because the Taliban wouldn't hand over Al Qaeda. Now, here we are 20 years later, and the foreign terrorist groups are back with free range in Afghanistan. And that is a threat to the security of all of us, whether you're in India, which is relatively close, or New Zealand, which is relatively far.
And as we've seen, this will be taken by extremist groups or fundamental groups, terrorist groups, as an inspiration of what can be achieved with what another superpower. So, what do you see?
Yeah, that's the worry, isn't it? I mean, here's an extremist insurgent group that has just, in effect, been given license to take over the country. Now, does it re-embolden ISIS in Iraq? Does it re-embolden Al-Shabaab in Somalia? Does it re-embolden Boko Haram in northeast Nigeria? Does it embolden the terrorists who are destroying the fabric of Burkina Faso and Mali? It is extremely concerning.
Helen Clark, absolutely appreciate your experience and expertise and your time on StratNews Global again.
Thank you.
Just a reminder to all our viewers, if you haven't subscribed to our YouTube channel, do that. You can also spread the word, whether it's on other social media handles, including on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram, about our channel. You can also help support us. You've been watching StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh.